Close your eyes. Right now, the world you know is dissolving. The heavy doors of the present are swinging shut, leaving the noise, the lights, and the hurried breath of today on the other side. You are stepping into a corridor of soft shadows where time no longer moves in seconds, but in the slow, steady pulse of history. You are safe. You are here, in this space. The air smells of old parchment and cooling evening rain. Can you feel it? The gentle weight of the past settling over you like a velvet quilt. Tonight, we are not searching for facts or dates to remember. We are looking for the quiet moments, the flickering candlelight in a composer's study, the rhythmic creak of a ship's hull, the silent resilience of a girl staring at a New York sunset. We are here to feel the texture of lives well lived, drifting together through a sanctuary built from the echoes of centuries. Before we drift further, let the tension in your jaw soften. Let your shoulders sink an inch deeper into your pillow. There is nothing to solve tonight, no information to retain, and no destination to reach. My voice is simply a steady lantern, casting a warm glow on the path ahead as we walk among giants. Tonight, you are joined by three souls who understood the profound beauty of a quiet mind. You will walk with Eleanor, who found a global voice within her own childhood silence. You will sit beside Leonardo, watching the gears of the universe turn in the margin of a notebook. And you will find refuge in the music of Beethoven, a man who, when his ears failed him, learned to hear the very heartbeat of the stars. They are not historical figures tonight. They are your guides, your companions in the stillness. They knew struggle, yes, but more importantly, they knew how to find the light when the world went dark. As we begin, notice how your breath has become a slow, rhythmic tide. With every exhale, you are traveling further from the now and closer to the then. The modern world is a ghost, and the past is becoming the only reality. We are moving toward a city of cobblestones and gaslights, toward a time when the nights were truly dark and the stars were the only map. Our journey starts in a grand house in old New York, filled with heavy curtains and long, silent hallways. In one of those rooms, a young girl with solemn eyes is trying to find where she belongs in a world that feels much too cold. She does not know yet that her quiet resilience will one day change the course of human rights for everyone. Let us leave the present behind and step softly into the early shadowed years of Eleanor. In 1899, at the age of 15, Eleanor arrived at Allenswood Academy, a progressive girls' school nestled in the gentle, mist-covered hills near London. For a girl who had spent a decade in the cold shadows of New York high society, this was more than a change of scenery. It was a profound awakening. Under the guidance of the headmistress, Marie Sylvestre, a woman who believed in challenging convention and awakening young minds to the realities of injustice, Eleanor finally found the permission she had been seeking to exist. Those 3 years in England left an indelible mark on her soul, as Sylvester encouraged Eleanor's natural intelligence and deep empathy, teaching her not just to speak, but to think and to question the world around her. The shy girl who had once whispered in drafty hallways blossomed into a young woman who was no longer afraid to feel or to act. By the time she returned to America, she carried a new sense of purpose, determined to ease the pain of others because she understood its weight so intimately. Upon her return, Eleanor re-entered the world of polished manners and social obligations, but she did so with a different heart. It was during this time, at the age of 20, that she found herself drawn to a distant cousin from the Hyde Park branch of her family, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin was charming, confident, and possessed an easy ambition that seemed to fill every room he entered. Their courtship was steady, and traditional, leading to a modest ceremony in 1905 where she was walked down the aisle by her uncle, President Theodore Roosevelt. In the early years of their marriage, Eleanor stepped dutifully into the role expected of her, managing a growing household and giving birth to 6 children. Yet, the warmth of her own home was often stifled by the presence of her mother-in-law, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, who maintained a rigid, controlling grip on the family. Sarah made the decisions, from how the household was run to how the children were raised, often making Eleanor feel like a guest in the very life she was building. Despite the domestic pressures, Eleanor's inner fire continued to stir as she began volunteering with social reform groups in the dim tenements and settlement houses of New York. She saw the faces of those the rest of society had forgotten, and the empathy she had nurtured during her lonely childhood found a concrete direction. But a great fracture was coming, one that would test the very foundation of her world. In 1918, Eleanor discovered a series of love letters that revealed an affair between Franklin and her own social secretary, Lucy Mercer. The betrayal was a cutting, deep wound that shattered her illusions of a conventional romantic union. Franklin chose to remain in the marriage for the sake of his political future and family pressure. But the emotional intimacy between them quietly dissolved. In the wake of this heartbreak, however, Eleanor found a strange and powerful kind of freedom, no longer defined solely as a supportive spouse in her husband's shadow. She began to carve out an identity that was entirely her own. She started to write, to organize, and to find her own voice in the public sphere. The pain of the betrayal did not destroy her. Instead, it acted as a catalyst, releasing her from the need for external approval and allowing her to stand on her own feet. Their marriage transformed into a strategic and complicated alliance, a partnership bound by shared duty and a vision for a better country. She learned that heartbreak, once it has been processed and endured, can transform into a quiet, unshakable strength. As Eleanor was becoming a leader in her own right, joining the League of Women Voters and the Democratic Party's women's division, she was also finding strength in a community of women activists and reformers who welcomed her as a peer. She traveled across the country, visiting coal mines and sweatshops, wanting to see and touch the issues she championed. She was no longer just Franklin's wife. She was an advocate, a teacher, and a woman of moral clarity. But just as she was finding her footing, another crisis would strike at the heart of their partnership, forcing her to step even further into the light. In 1921, Franklin was struck by polio, an illness that would leave him paralyzed from the waist down and change the course of their lives forever. With his political future in jeopardy, Eleanor realized she would have to become his eyes, his ears, and eventually his legs in the world of American politics. In the quiet autumn of 1899, at the age of 15, Eleanor arrived at Allenswood Academy, a progressive girls' school nestled deeply within the gentle, mist-covered hills just outside of London. For a girl who had spent nearly a decade wandering through the cold, judgment-filled shadows of New York high society, this was far more than a mere change of scenery. It was a profound, soul-stirring awakening. Under the wise and maternal guidance of the headmistress, Marie Souvestre, a woman who believed fervently in challenging social conventions and awakening young minds to the painful realities of global injustice, Eleanor finally found the silent permission she had been seeking her entire life. The permission to simply exist as herself. Those 3 formative years under the gray English skies left an indelible mark on her very soul. Souvestre did not see a plain girl. She saw a brilliant mind and a heart of vast untapped empathy. She encouraged Eleanor to not just speak, but to think critically and to question the world that lay beyond the polished silver of her upbringing. The shy, trembling girl who had once whispered in drafty hallways blossomed into a poised young woman who was no longer afraid to feel deeply or to act decisively. By the time she eventually returned to the shores of America, she carried within her a new, steady sense of purpose. She had known the sharp sting of pain, and because of it, she was determined to spend the rest of her days trying to ease that same pain in the lives of others. Upon her return to New York, Eleanor re-entered the world of polished manners and heavy social obligations. Yet she did so with a heart that no longer quite fit into the old mold. It was during this period of transition, at the age of 20, that she found herself drawn to a young man from her extended family, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was a distant fifth cousin, a man of effortless charm, radiating a confidence and a sunny ambition that seemed to fill every room he entered. Their courtship was steady, reflecting the traditions of their class, and in 1905 they were married in a ceremony graced by the presence of her uncle, President Theodore Roosevelt, who walked her down the aisle in place of her late father. In the early years of their long union, Eleanor stepped dutifully into the role the world expected of her. She managed a growing, complex household and gave birth to 6 children, though she would carry the silent grief of losing one in infancy. Yet, the warmth she hoped for in her own home was often stifled by the formidable presence of her mother-in-law, Sarah Delano Roosevelt. Sarah maintained a rigid iron grip on the household, making the decisions on everything from the color of the curtains to how the children were raised. For many years, Eleanor yielded to this pressure, often feeling like a mere guest in the very life she was supposed to be leading. However, beneath that quiet, yielding exterior, something vital was stirring. Eleanor began to find her own sanctuary in service, volunteering with social reform groups in the dim, overcrowded tenements of New York's poor. In those forgotten corners of the city, she saw the faces of people society had chosen to ignore, and the empathy she had nurtured during her own lonely childhood finally found a concrete, powerful direction. But a great, painful fracture was approaching, one that would test the very bedrock of her world. In 1918, Eleanor discovered a bundle of love letters that revealed a devastating affair between Franklin and her own social secretary, Lucy Mercer. The betrayal was a cutting, ice-cold wound that shattered her every illusion of a conventional, romantic marriage. Franklin, pressured by his political advisors and his formidable mother, chose to remain in the marriage to protect his career. But the emotional closeness they once shared quietly dissolved into a distant, professional respect. Yet, out of this profound heartbreak, Eleanor found a strange and magnificent kind of freedom. With her old illusions gone, she began to carve out an identity that was entirely separate from her husband's shadow. She was no longer just the supportive spouse. She began to write, to organize, and to find the true power of her own voice in the public sphere. The pain did not destroy her. It acted as a catalyst, releasing her from the stifling need for social approval. She realized that heartbreak, once it has been fully endured and integrated, transforms into a quiet, unshakable strength, a strength that no one can ever take away from you. As the 1920s began, Eleanor was emerging as a formidable leader in her own right, joining the League of Women Voters and the Democratic Party's Women's Division. She traveled across the vast landscape of the country, descending into coal mines and walking through sweatshops, determined to not just hear about injustice, but to see and touch it herself. She was becoming Eleanor Roosevelt, the advocate, the teacher, and the woman of unwavering moral clarity. But just as she was truly finding her footing, a sudden crisis struck at the very heart of their partnership, threatening to end everything they had built. In 1921, during a family vacation, Franklin was struck by a severe and mysterious illness that was soon diagnosed as polio. It left him paralyzed from the waist down, a devastating blow for a man whose life was built on movement and political ascent. As Franklin withdrew into the shadows of recovery at Hyde Park, Eleanor realized that the time for whispering was over. She would have to step boldly forward, becoming his eyes, his ears, and his presence in the world, standing tall, so that he would not have to disappear. In the quiet, freezing spring of 1933, as the heavy cast-iron gates of the White House swung open to welcome the 32nd president, the entire nation watched as a long-standing tradition was gently but firmly broken in real time. While the world and the cautious political establishment fully expected Eleanor Roosevelt to settle into the traditional, ceremonial role of a silent hostess arranging flowers, hosting tea parties, and remaining a muted observer of history, she had absolutely no interest in fading into the velvet background. Almost immediately, with a quiet but unyielding determination, she began to carve out a space that was entirely, unapologetically her own, transforming the very definition of what it meant to be a first lady. She did not wait for formal invitations or political permission. She simply moved with a steady heart toward the people who needed her most, turning the cold, white halls of power into a living bridge to the most forgotten corners of a suffering country. She became a woman in constant, purposeful, and rhythmic motion, traveling tens of thousands of miles across the vast American landscape, often alone, often without the distracting fanfare of official photographers or a sprawling entourage. Eleanor descended into the dark, damp, and dangerous coal mines of Appalachia, feeling the grit of the earth on her own skin. She walked across the cracked, barren soil of the Dust Bowl, where the wind carried the dust of broken dreams, and she sat quietly with black families in the deeply, painfully segregated South. She did not visit these places as a distant, lofty dignitary looking down from a height, but as a fellow American who possessed a rare and sacred gift, a quiet, patient attentiveness. She listened for hours to the stories of desperation, hunger, and poverty, looking directly into the tired eyes of those society had long ago chosen to overlook, and she carried the heavy weight of their voices back with her to the Capitol. Each night, in the stillness of the executive mansion, she would slip handwritten notes to Franklin, telling him exactly what the people were saying, what they feared in the depths of the night, and what they dared to hope for when the sun rose. In a bold and unprecedented move that challenged the rigid, male-dominated world of journalism, Eleanor began holding regular, weekly press conferences. However, she insisted on one revolutionary rule: only women reporters were allowed to attend. At a time when female journalists were consistently marginalized, underpaid, and ignored by their editors, Eleanor created an exclusive, powerful space for them, effectively forcing major newspapers to hire and retain women if they wanted any access to the White House. She also became the first lady to write a daily, syndicated newspaper column titled My Day, where she used plain, honest, and unpolished language to describe the suffering and the incredible resilience she witnessed on her lonely travels. Through her daily words, she spoke directly into the kitchens and living rooms of the people, and for the very first time in American history, the common citizen felt truly heard and seen by the high halls of power. Of course, her radical actions drew sharp, frequent, and often cruel criticism from those who felt her behavior was unladylike, or that she was meddling far too deeply in the serious affairs of government. Cruel political cartoons frequently mocked her physical appearance, her large teeth and her strong, unwavering opinions. Yet, Eleanor refused to shrink herself, or quiet her voice simply to make the comfortable feel more secure. She championed causes that were decades, perhaps even a century, ahead of their time: affordable public housing, child welfare, and the urgent necessity of racial justice. She understood with a deep inner clarity that true leadership was not defined by a title or a seat at a mahogany table, but by the courage to stand up for the vulnerable, especially when that stance was deeply unpopular and politically dangerous. Perhaps the most defining act of her moral compass occurred in the spring of 1939, when the organization known as the Daughters of the American Revolution, of which Eleanor was a member, refused to let the world-renowned black opera singer Marian Anderson perform at Constitution Hall simply because of the color of her skin. Eleanor did not hesitate. She did not attempt to mediate from behind closed doors or offer a soft compromise. Instead, she publicly resigned from the organization and published her resignation letter for the entire country to read. She then worked tirelessly behind the scenes to help arrange for Marian Anderson to perform an open-air concert at the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday. As 75,000 people stood in a profound, emotional silence, listening to a voice that echoed off the stone monuments of freedom, the First Lady stood nearby, not on the stage, but in the crowd. She was no longer just the wife of a president. She had become the very conscience of a nation, a steady, flickering light in a world that was growing increasingly dim. There is a profound rhythmic beauty in a life lived entirely for the sake of others, a kindness that operates like a slow, steady heartbeat beneath the chaotic noise of world events. Eleanor Roosevelt proved to the world that compassion is not a fragile weakness, but a durable, timeless, and indestructible power that can reshape a nation's entire understanding of itself. As you listen to the echoes of her long walks and her tireless advocacy, let your own mind find a similar rhythm of peace and safety. Kindness, in its purest and most selfless form, is a melody that never grows old, a soft, low song that can be heard clearly even in the loudest and most terrifying of storms. But even as Eleanor built this magnificent legacy of light and human dignity, a great and terrifying darkness was beginning to sweep across the global horizon. The fragile, glittering prosperity of the previous decade was about to shatter into a million jagged pieces, leaving millions of families in a state of sudden, overwhelming, and suffocating despair. When the global economy finally collapsed in the autumn of 1929, the quiet resilience Eleanor had spent her entire difficult life building would become the only thing strong enough to hold a breaking country together. As the heavy bank doors closed and the lines for bread grew longer and longer in the cold city streets, we move now from the life of one extraordinary woman to the raw survival of an entire people. Imagine the sun setting over a landscape of silent factories and empty pockets as we enter the era of the Great Shadow. The vibrant, electric energy of the roaring 20s, with its glittering, sun-drenched skyscrapers, and the frantic, joyful pulse of jazz echoing through every open window, began to flicker and fade like a dying candle on a cool Tuesday morning in October 1929. It started quietly, almost invisibly, just a few numbers dipping on a clicking ticker tape, a few furrowed brows on the chaotic floor of the New York Stock Exchange. But by the end of that fateful day, the very floor of the American economy had simply given way. Black Tuesday arrived like a sudden, uninvited winter, erasing massive fortunes in a matter of hours and shattering the long-held, glittering illusion that prosperity would never end. The air in the city grew heavy with a new, suffocating kind of silence. The frantic, greedy shouting of traders was replaced by the hollow, echoing sound of slow footsteps on cold pavement as men walked home, in a daze to tell their families that the world they knew had changed forever. The foundation of the American dream, which had seemed so solid and immovable, was revealed to be brittle and thin, leaving an entire nation to wake up in a shadow that would stretch for a long, weary decade. As the slow weeks turned into agonizing months, the ripples of that initial collapse became a tidal wave that washed over every remote corner of the country. Banks, once the sturdy, reliable pillars of every small community, began to lock their heavy brass doors, leaving terrified depositors to find only empty vaults and broken promises. In the great cities, the landscape shifted into a somber, gray portrait of survival. Once proud men in worn wool coats and frayed hats, who had only months before held steady jobs, now stood in breadlines that stretched for silent blocks, waiting for hours in the biting winter wind for a single bowl of thin, watery soup. On the desolate outskirts of these cities, makeshift towns built of cardboard, scrap metal, and discarded wood began to rise bitterly, named Hoovervilles, by those who felt completely abandoned by their own government. Inside these fragile shanties, families huddled together for warmth, burning old newspapers to keep the bone-deep chill at bay, their lives reduced to the most basic, raw elements of human existence. Ambition was replaced by a quiet, desperate endurance, as the entire rhythm of American life slowed to the pace of a long, uncertain wait for a tomorrow that felt increasingly distant. Yet in this period of profound and universal loss, something unexpected and beautiful began to emerge from the wreckage of the markets. When the bank accounts were finally drained, and the fine clothes had worn thin at the elbows, the true, unvarnished value of a human soul was finally revealed. Without the frantic distraction of seeking wealth, or the deafening noise of material success, people began to look at one another with a new, raw, and honest clarity. Neighbors shared their last remaining loaves of bread, and entire communities pulled their meager, dwindling resources together to ensure that no child in the neighborhood went to bed entirely hungry. Dignity, which many had thought was tied exclusively to a steady paycheck or a grand title, was found instead in the quiet sacrifice of a mother skipping her own meal so her children could eat, or a stranger offering a warm, kind word on a cold street corner. It was a time of immense, heavy sorrow, but also a time of deep, unspoken solidarity, a powerful reminder that when everything else is stripped away by the winds of fortune, our connection to one another is the only thing that truly remains. As you listen to my voice, imagine the sound of those slow, steady footsteps on the darkened cobblestones of a 1930s evening. The city around you is dim, the lights in the grand shop windows are dark, and the only sound is the rhythmic collective breathing of a nation trying to find its way back to hope in the dark. There is a strange, profound peace in this stillness, a sense that we are all walking through the same long, quiet night together. Let the heaviness of the past settle around you like a thick, soft fog, protective and unthreatening, as we realize that even in the deepest shadow, the human spirit does not break. It simply waits, breathing softly, for the light to return. The transient nature of wealth is but a passing cloud in the vast sky of time, and your rest tonight is far more precious and enduring than any gold. But as the great cities struggled in their quiet, urban despair, the heartland of the country was facing a different, more primal kind of fury. The shadow falling over America was not just economic. In the West, it was becoming literal, rising from the parched earth in great, black, suffocating clouds that threatened to swallow the very sun, while the breadlines grew in the concrete canyons of New York and Chicago. The very soil of the Great Plains was beginning to rise in a desperate, angry rebellion against those who had mistreated it. The struggle for survival was about to move from the cold city streets to the dying, dusty fields, where the land itself was turning to powder under a scorched and unforgiving sky. Let us travel now to the plains, where the wind is beginning to whisper of a coming storm. In the vast, open heartland of the Great Plains, a different kind of silence began to settle over the earth, a silence not of peace, but of a parched and gasping land. For decades, the soil had been generous, yielding golden waves of wheat and corn under the persistent labor of hopeful farmers. But the rains, once so reliable, simply stopped, leaving the ground to bake under a scorched and unforgiving sun until the fertile earth turned to a fine, gray powder. The Nuansteisen. Then came the wind, restless and primal, sweeping across the flat horizon, with a force that had no obstacles to slow it down. What began as a breeze soon became a monstrous, rolling wall of darkness, great dust storms, some hundreds of miles wide, that loomed over the prairie like ancient, angry spirits. These black blizzards swallowed entire farmsteads in an instant, turning high noon into the deepest, most suffocating night. Imagine standing by a window as the light begins to fail, watching as the horizon vanishes behind a curtain of swirling grit. The dust did not just fall, it invaded, creeping through the smallest cracks in the floorboard, under the heavy wooden doors, and into the very lungs of those huddled inside. Families sat in the dim glow of a single kerosene lamp, wet cloths pressed over their faces just to breathe, listening to the relentless, scouring sound of sand against the glass. Outside, the world was being erased. Fences were buried, cattle were choked by the silt, and the once green fields were transformed into a desolate, lunar landscape of shifting dunes. It was a catastrophe that felt biblical, as if the very atmosphere had turned against the hands that had tilled it. As the land withered and the storms grew more frequent, the hope that had anchored families to their soil finally began to drift away with the wind. Tens of thousands of people, reaching a breaking point of despair, packed their entire lives into rickety trucks and rusted sedans, tying mattresses to the roofs and piling children into the back seats. They abandoned the homes their fathers had built, fleeing westward toward the whispered promise of California, a land where the fruit was said to be free and the air was clear of the killing dust. These were the Okies, a displaced people wandering a broken country, their faces lined with the grit of 1,000 miles and the deep, quiet exhaustion of the dispossessed. Along the edges of the highways, mothers with hollow eyes and sun-scorched skin sat by makeshift tents, cradling infants while staring into an uncertain future with a haunting, stoic grace. They were moving through a dream of survival, driven by a primal need to find a place where the earth was still kind. In this dark era, a painful truth was revealed. The land had not simply failed on its own, it had been pushed beyond its limits. For years, the native grasses that had anchored the soil for centuries were torn up to make room for profit, leaving the earth vulnerable to the whims of the wind. The land had, in a sense, rebelled because humanity had forgotten the sacred rhythm of respect and balance that nature demands. It was a harsh lesson in humility, a reminder that we are not the masters of the elements, but merely their guests. The Dust Bowl was a storm of our own making, a physical manifestation of a spiritual disconnect between the people and the earth that sustained them. As you drift now toward your own rest, listen to the imagined sound of that wind as it rits through the cracks of a distant, lonely farmhouse. It is a lonely, haunting whistle, the sound of the world breathing in its sleep. But even in its fury, The wind eventually tires. The dust eventually settles back into the ground, and the storm, no matter how vast, always finds its end. Everything in this life moves in cycles, and the darkness of the dust is but a long exhale before the earth learns to breathe again. You are safe now, far from the storms and the grit, wrapped in a stillness that the wind cannot touch. Let the sound of the ancient plains lull you deeper into the velvet folds of Thea. Night, knowing that even the harshest winter is followed by a slow, inevitable thawing. Though the heartland was buried in shadows and the cities were frozen in economic despair, a new voice was beginning to reach through the static of the old radios. Across the country, in kitchens and darkened living rooms, people began to gather around a flickering orange light, listening to words that promised a different kind of weather. A leader was rising who understood that to heal the land, one must first heal the spirit of the people. The era of the Great Shadow was about to meet the warmth of the fireside as the nation prepared to listen to the first messages of a New Deal. On a cold, grey March day in 1933, a voice unlike any the nation had ever heard before reached out through the crackling static of millions of home radio. Huddled in darkened living rooms across the continent, the only thing we have to fear, Franklin Delano Roosevelt proclaimed with a steady, ironclad confidence that seemed to vibrate through the very airwaves, is fear itself. It was a sentence that acted like a physical weight, suddenly lifting off the chest of a gasping, terrified country. For years, America had been paralyzed, not just by a lack of circulating money, but by a profound, soul-deep lack of belief in the possibility of a future. FDR did not just offer a list of complex policies. He offered a warm, steady hand to pull the country out of the dark. His presence was warm, his smile was made of steel, and his words were a sacred promise that no one, no matter how far they had fallen into the cracks of poverty, would be left behind in the cold shadows of neglect. This era of national healing became known as the New Deal, a sweeping, ambitious collection of programs that acted as a desperate lifeline for a breaking nation. It was never just about economic recovery. It was about the painstaking restoration of the human spirit. Across the vast, scarred American landscape, the rhythmic, comforting sound of work began to return to the air. In the great, silent national parks and the ancient forests of the West, the Civilian Conservation Corps, affectionately known as the CCC, gave hundreds of thousands of young, unemployed men a reason to wake up with the first light of the sun. They lived in disciplined camps, planting millions of trees to heal the dust-choked earth and building sturdy stone shelters and winding trails that still stand today as quiet monuments to their labor. These young men sent the vast majority of their modest wages home to their struggling families, but they kept something far more precious for their own soul: the honest calluses on their hands and the quiet, unshakable pride of a hard day's work well done. In the small towns and bustling cities, the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, began to transform the very face of the country's infrastructure. But it was not just roads and massive bridges being built. It was a sanctuary for the creative mind. For the first time in history, the government recognized that a painter, a musician, or a lonely writer was as essential to the nation's survival as a farmer or a stonemason. Artists were commissioned to fill the red brick walls of local post offices with vibrant, sweeping murals that celebrated the everyday, unvarnished beauty of American working life. Musicians played free, soul-stirring concerts in town squares, and writers traveled the dusty back roads to record the oral histories of the last surviving former slaves. ensuring that the vital voices of the past would never be silenced by the encroaching dust of time. This was a unique period where the local community became the hearth of the nation, and every new project was a solid brick in the wall against the cold winds of despair. The most profound revelation of this entire era was that the government was providing something much deeper than just physical relief. While they distributed essential bread and milk to the hungry, their greatest, most enduring gift was the return of human dignity. By creating meaningful jobs that served the public good, they gave people back their very identities. A man was no longer just an anonymous number in a weary breadline. He was once again a builder of his country. A woman was no longer just a helpless victim of cruel circumstance. She was a vital participant in a grand national recovery. The New Deal taught us, in the most difficult of times, that a society is only as strong as its capacity for compassion, and that true, lasting safety is found in the simple knowledge that your neighbor's welfare is as vital as your own. As you settle even deeper into the softness of your blankets, imagine the soft, comforting orange glow of a 1930s radio dial in a perfectly darkened living room. Listen to the imagined gentle crackle of the airwaves as the president begins one of his legendary fireside chats. His voice is calm, fatherly, and slow, speaking directly to you, as if he were sitting in the worn velvet chair just across from your own bed. Outside, the winter wind may still blow against the glass, but inside this room, the air is warm and the door is safely locked against the world's cold. There is a deep, resonant peace in this invisible connection, a sense of belonging to a human story that is much larger and older than yourself. The struggle of those years was real, but so was the slow, steady recovery, and the light always, eventually found its way back into the room to stay. The nation was slowly, carefully stitching itself back together, one job, one tree, and one mural at a time. We had learned, through fire and dust, to survive the harsh, biting reality of poverty, but our minds were beginning to crave something more, something that transcended the simple need for hunger and the clearing of the dust. From the exhausting struggle for daily bread, we moved now to a different, more celestial kind of hunger, the hunger for absolute, eternal truth and universal beauty. We leave the 20th century behind and drift further back into the misty corridors of the past, toward a mind that saw the world not as a place of scarcity, but as a perpetual miracle of infinite divine design. From the New Deal of people, we dream our way toward the timeless silver wisdom of a man who wrote in secret and thought in pure light, the incomparable Leonardo da Vinci. We travel back now, drifting far beyond the fading echoes of the 20th century, crossing the vast oceans of time to the year 1452, in the quiet, sun-drenched Tuscan village of Vinci. Here, amidst the silver-green olive groves and the persistent, rhythmic hum of cicadas in the heat, a mind was born that would eventually outpace the rest of the world by more than 500 years. Leonardo da Vinci did not come from a lineage of wealth or attend the grand, formal universities of his day. He was, first and foremost, a child of nature. He was a self-taught observer who saw the world not as a collection of static objects, but as a grand interlocking puzzle of energy and motion waiting to be solved. As he moved through the vibrant, high-stakes courts of Florence and Milan, he was never without a small, leather-bound bundle of papers tucked securely into his belt. These were his private notebooks, over 13,000 pages of meticulous sketches, cryptic riddles, and revolutionary theories that he guarded with a strange, beautiful, and lifelong secrecy. To open one of these weathered notebooks today is to step directly into the engine room of a singular genius. The very first thing you might notice as you lean closer is that the handwriting is not merely elegant, it is profoundly mysterious. The delicate letters flow from right to left, a perfectly reversed mirror writing that seems specifically designed to be read only by the author himself, or perhaps by a ghost trapped in a reflection. Some historians believe he was carefully hiding his radical, often heretical ideas from the prying, dangerous eyes of the church or greedy rivals. Others suggest it was simply the practical, quiet habit of a left-handed man who did not want to smudge the fresh, wet sepia ink across the parchment as his hand moved. Whatever the hidden reason, the effect is one of deep, whispered intimacy. It feels as though we are peering over his shoulder in the dim, flickering candlelight of a midnight studio, watching a mind in constant, swirling, and restless motion. In these private pages, Leonardo's imagination took flight long before the physical materials of the world were ready to follow the heights of his thought. He sketched detailed blueprints for machines that read like the finest modern science fiction. You might see a painstakingly drawn diagram for an aerial screw, the ancient precursor to our modern helicopter, designed on the elegant principle that air, like heavy water, could be gripped, coiled, and pushed if only a blade could be made to spin with enough velocity. Nearby, on a page yellowed by centuries, he drew a massive, intimidating armored vehicle, shaped like a prehistoric turtle and bristling with rotating cannons, intended to move with slow, unstoppable force across a chaotic battlefield. Most astonishing of all was his design for a mechanical knight, a primitive but functional robot composed of a dizzying array of complex pulleys and internal brass gears that could sit upright, wave its metal arms, and even move its articulated jaw, as if speaking a silent, forgotten language. He spent countless hours dismantling old clocks and watching the heavy, moss-covered wooden wheels of watermills turn, not just to see what they did, but to understand the very soul of mechanics, the precise laws of leverage, the invisible flow of torque, and the fluid distribution of energy through a system. The profound revelation hidden within these secret inks is that Leonardo did not look at the world merely as it appeared to the naked, casual eye. He looked at it as a magnificent system of operation. He did not just see a bird in flight. He saw the intricate mathematics of lift and the structural tension of a feathered wing. He did not just see a rushing river. He saw the spiraling, violent physics of an eddy and the relentless, patient spirit of water as it sought the path of least resistance. To Leonardo, there were no artificial fences between the worlds of art, science, and engineering. A massive bridge, a delicate painting, and a simple flower were all expressions of the same universal laws of harmony, geometry, and proportion. He believed with a quiet ferocity that by understanding the small, hidden gears of nature, we could eventually build a human world that moved in perfect, silent rhythm with the clockwork of the universe. As you drift now toward an even deeper, more settled stillness, imagine the physical sensation of those ancient notebooks in your hands. Picture the thick, cream-colored parchment feeling slightly rough and textured under the pads of your fingertips. Visualize the dark, rich sepia ink flowing backward across the page in the dim light, forming intricate, swirling diagrams of gears and wings that seem to pulse with a hidden life of their own. There is a hypnotic, lulling quality to the way his lines curve and spiral, mirroring the very whirlpools, clouds, and vines he studied so intently in the fields of Tuscany. Let the complexity of his imagined machine The interlocking cogs, the hidden tension of the springs, the heavy comforting weight of the oak and iron occupy your mind until it grows tired of thinking and begins to simply feel the structural beauty of the design. The world is a vast, well-ordered, and benevolent machine, and tonight you are perfectly safe within its predictable, rhythmic embrace. Leonardo's curiosity was a steady, unquenchable flame that burned through every subject he touched, from the slow, majestic movement of the distant planets to the startlingly complex anatomy of the tongue of a woodpecker. He spent his entire life trying to map the invisible divine forces that govern everything we see and touch. But of all the intricate designs he labored over in the silence of his rooms, of all the armored tanks, canal systems, and flying screws, there was one machine that he considered to be the most miraculous and profound of all, a masterpiece of high engineering that required no wood, no metal, and no grease, but only the sacred elements of flesh, bone, and indomitable spirit. From the cold, theoretical blueprints of his mechanical inventions, we move now into the warm, living architecture of the human form itself. We watch as Leonardo turns his secret, mirrored ink toward the most perfect machine ever created in the history of the world, the body that carries us through our dreams, in the deep, velvet stillness of the Renaissance night, while the rest of the weary world lay in unsuspecting slumber. Leonardo da Vinci worked in the flickering, amber glow of a few guttering wax candles. In these quiet, sacred hours, far away from the judgmental eyes of the church and the bustling, chaotic noise of the Florentine streets, he performed meticulous dissections that were, in his mind, as much an act of prayer as they were of science. To Leonardo, the human body was never a dark mystery to be feared or a mere vessel of sin, but a magnificent structural masterpiece of divine and intentional engineering. With a steady hand and a fearless, quiet precision, he peeled back the layers of mortal flesh to reveal the intricate silver-white lattice of the skeleton, the powerful braided tension of the muscles, and the delicate web-like map of the entire nervous system. He recorded every finding with an artist's soul and an engineer's relentless eye, creating anatomical drawings so accurate and detailed that they would not be rivaled by medical science for many centuries to come. As you lie here now, in the absolute safety and warmth of your own room, imagine his silver-point pen moving slowly and rhythmically across the parchment, sketching the sturdy, elegant architecture of the human foot or the perfect weight-bearing curve of the human spine. Leonardo looked at our bones, not as mere remains, but as the load-bearing beams of a living cathedral, designed to withstand the immense pressures of gravity and motion with effortless, silent grace. He examined the brain and the complex, hidden network of nerves, seeing them as the unseen messengers that carry the electric spark of thought from the mind to the very tips of the fingers. He was captivated by the way a single, slender tendon could transfer immense power from a muscle to a joint, a mechanical marvel of efficiency that no machine made of wood or iron could ever truly replicate. In the very center of this living temple, Leonardo discovered the most profound and tireless engine of all, the heart. At a time when its true function was still a matter of ancient myth and medical guesswork, he saw it clearly for what it truly was, a sophisticated, rhythmic machine. Using wax casts to study the intricate hidden chambers, he was the first to accurately describe how the heart's delicate valves opened and closed like the gates of a great, silent canal. He marveled at the heart as a double pump, a rhythmic and powerful source that circulated the very essence of life through a looped and unending system of vessels. And nearby he studied the eyes with equal wonder, seeing them not just as windows, but a sophisticated optical instrument's lenses that captured the golden light of the world and translated it into the silent language of the human soul. The sacred revelation of these lonely midnight studies was the realization that we are not separate from the natural world, but a concentrated, beautiful reflection of it. Leonardo observed that the branching of the bronze-colored veins in a human arm mirrored the delta of a great river reaching for the distant sea. He saw that the way our lungs expand and contract followed the same ancient, rhythmic laws as the winds that sweep across the Tuscan hills. To Leonardo, every mchmao is a winding river. Every bone is a solid, ancient stone. And M-I-H, Allah, M-A, date, C-N. Jua ma de C-N, jaw, a brief. Just makes the vast inner landscape of. To him, the human form was the ultimate Vitruvian ideal, the precise point where the geometry of the earth and the architecture of the heavens met in a perfect, harmonious circle. Take a long, slow moment now to feel the quiet, miraculous operation of your own body as it prepares for rest. Siem chan dong mao chi chong. Si da bam lu nae. Warm, steady, and benevolent tide moving through thousands of miles of hidden earthways, directed by a heart that knows its own rhythm perfectly without you ever having to ask it. Notice the comforting weight of your limbs against the mattress, the softness of your breath, and the way your muscles have finally surrendered their long day's tension to the gentle gravity of the bed. You are a masterpiece of balance, harmony, and intent a living symphony of motion and stillness that continues its vital work even while you drift into sleep. There is a profound, holy safety in the way you are built, a structural integrity that protects you and sustains you through the long, velvet hours of the night. Leonardo spent his final years in the quiet service of a king, far from his birthplace, but he never once stopped asking questions or sketching the wonders he found in the smallest leaf or the subtle curve of a human lip. He found a deep, eternal hai-hoa in the infinite patterns of nature, a visual music that he spent his entire long life trying to transcribe onto paper. But as we leave the sun-drenched, quiet studios of the Renaissance and drift toward a different kind of mastery, we encounter a man whose music was not seen with the eyes, but heard in the depths of a profound and heavy silence. Leonardo found harmony in the visible world. C.N.H.J. Beethoven. Team Tai no Trong im Elian. Music born, not of the ears, but of the indestructible, soaring spirit. We move now toward the stormy, silent world of the great composer, where the most magnificent sounds were born from the absolute velvet stillness of the soul. The world of Ludwig van Beethoven began with the most vibrant and chaotic of sounds, the rushing, cold waters of the Rhine River, the festive, ringing bells of Bonn, and the thunderous, standing applause of the great, gilded concert halls in Vienna. He was a man who lived entirely through his ears, a restless genius who captured the turbulent, raw emotions of humanity and translated them into the language of ivory and string. But in his late 20s, a faint, persistent, and terrifying ringing began to haunt his quietest moments. At first, it was like the distant, harmless hum of a summer insect, easily ignored in the bustle of the day. But slowly, inexorably, the hum grew into a dull roar, and the high notes of the flute began to lose their brilliant sparkle. The voices of his dearest friends became muffled and distant, as if they were speaking through a thick, heavy velvet curtain. Imagine the sheer, overwhelming terror of a master weaver losing his sight, or a painter watching the vibrant colors of the world fade into a flat, dusty gray. For Beethoven, the looming silence was not just a physical ailment. It was a spiritual catastrophe that threatened to erase his very identity and silence his soul. In the autumn of 1802, desperate for a cure and drowning in a deep, dark sea of isolation, he retreated to the quiet, rural village of Heiligenstadt. There, amidst the rustling leaves, he could no longer truly hear, and the bird's song fading into a grey mist. He wrote a long, agonizing letter to his brothers, a document of raw, bleeding honesty, now known as the Heiligenstadt Testament. He confessed his deep, burning shame, his paralyzing fear of being discovered as a deaf composer, and his dark, heavy temptations to leave a world that had become so cruelly, unfairly quiet. But as he sat in that profound, heavy stillness, a new and radical realization began to dawn. He realized that the music inside him was not dependent on the vibration of the air or the mechanical operation of the ear. It was a part of his indestructible soul, a fire that no physical limitation could ever extinguish. He chose to stay. He chose to fight. He decided that if he could no longer hear the music of the world, he would create a music that the world had never even dared to imagine. This fierce defiance sparked a creative transformation that changed the history of human art forever. As the outer world faded into a total, velvety silence, his inner world exploded into a magnificent symphony of light and shadow. He no longer needed to hear the piano with his ears. He felt its deep resonance in his very bones, and bit down on a wooden stick to feel the vibrations of the soundboard. He composed not from memory, but from a place of pure mathematical intuition and absolute spiritual necessity. The Ninth Symphony, the late string quartets, these were works born from the absolute velvet stillness of a mind that had transcended the limitations of the physical senses. Every note was a rhythmic rebellion against the dark, every melody a silver thread pulled from the infinite. As his ears closed to the world, his soul began to open to the harmonies of the heavens. Take a long, slow moment now to breathe into that same protective stillness. Imagine the heavy, velvet silence that surrounded Beethoven as he worked in the absolute middle of the night, his mind moving through landscapes of sound that no one else could perceive. There are no distractions here, no voices, no demands, and no noise. There is only the rhythmic, steady, and comforting pulse of your own heart. As you drift closer to the edge of sleep, notice how the sounds of your own room are beginning to soften and recede into the distance. The world outside your window is moving further and further away, leaving you in a sanctuary of perfect peace. Let the world around you dissolve into absolute stillness. You are drifting in a vast, calm, and endless ocean of silence, where every worry is a single grain of sand sinking slowly, quietly, and forever to the bottom. Beethoven found that his silence was not a terrifying void, but a vast white canvas upon which he could paint his greatest and most enduring masterpieces. He gave the world an ode to joy from a place where he could not hear a single note of the thunderous, weeping ovation that followed its premiere. He proved to us all that the human spirit is indestructible, and that the most beautiful and profound things are often those we cannot see or hear with our senses, but only feel with the core of our being. And in that silence, in that absolute peaceful surrender to the music of the soul, a final monumental symphony was born, a sound that would echo through the long centuries, even as the man who created it drifted into his own well-earned eternal rest. The names we've spoken together tonight, Eleanor, Leonardo, Ludwig, have long since passed into the quiet, silvered pages of history. Their physical journeys have ended, their ink has long since dried, and their music has faded into the cool night air. but the resonance of their lives remains, vibrating through the very fabric of the world we inhabit today, like a bell that continues to ring long after it has been struck. They were ordinary people who faced extraordinary, heavy shadows, loneliness, poverty, and the weight of silence, and yet they refused to let the darkness define the boundaries of their lives. They left behind ripples of compassion, curiosity, and courage that continue to touch us in the quiet, honest moments of our own lives. As you lie here, remember that you are a vital part of this same, enduring tapestry of human experience. The resilience of Eleanor lives in your own ability to stand tall in the face of change. The wonder of Leonardo is in the way you dream of the impossible. And the harmony of Beethoven is in the quiet, steady strength of your own heart. These stories are not closed, dusty books. They are living legacies that wait patiently for you to pick them up again tomorrow, or perhaps in another night yet to come. Their story does not end. It continues in your dreams tonight. Perhaps you will revisit these halls of history in your sleep, finding new, sun-drenched paths and hidden rooms of absolute peace. And when you wake, you will carry a tiny fragment of their light with you back into the world. Now, there is only peace. The stories have all been told. The candles have burned low to the wick, and the long, echoing corridors of the past are settled deeply in shadow. There is nothing left for you to do now but to let go. Every thought of the day, every flicker of concern, every heavy task is dissolving into the soft, warm, and protective darkness of this perfect moment. Every worry has faded. Only the music of silence remains, a slow, rhythmic, and ancient lullaby that carries you deeper and deeper into the very heart of the night. You are safe. The world is at rest. The stars are watching over the quiet, breathing earth, just as they watched over the olive groves of Vinci and the silent streets of Vienna. You are held in the warm embrace of a history that is kind and a future that is still. Let the soft light of the moon be your only guide as you drift across the final threshold into a deep, heavy, and restorative sleep. Good night, sleep well,